The morning light cut through the blinds of Mercy General Hospital's administrative wing in sharp, golden slats, falling across the polished mahogany desk of Dr. Harrison Whitfield III like a spotlight on a stage. He was the kind of man who had been told he was brilliant so many times, and by so many people, that he had long since stopped questioning whether it was true. At 54, with silver temples and a jaw that looked carved from the same marble as the hospital's donor plaques, Dr. Whitfield was chief of surgery, head of the hospital's credentialing committee, and by his own quiet estimation, the most important person in any room he entered. He picked up the resume with 2 fingers. The way one might handle something pulled from the bottom of a lost and found bin. The woman sitting across from him was 31 years old, with pale blue eyes that didn't flinch and dark blonde hair pulled back into a practical bun. Her name was Claire Elise Morgan, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight but not stiff, her expression composed in the particular way of someone who had learned to keep their face a locked room. She wore a navy blazer, over a white blouse, simple pearl earrings, no other jewelry. She looked, Dr. Whitfield thought with a private satisfaction, exactly like a nurse applying for a position she was almost qualified for. Mercy General University, he said, reading aloud from the resume. He let the name hang in the air like a question mark. Nursing program. That's correct, Claire said. Not Johns Hopkins, not Penn. He set the resume down and leaned back in his chair, pressing the tips of his fingers together in the arch that medical school colleagues had once called his thinking pose, and that his ex-wife had called something considerably less flattering. Mercy General University. Also correct. His eyes dropped back to the paper. And before the nursing program, I see a gap. For years. What were you doing for 4 years, Ms. Morgan? Claire held his gaze. Federal service. Federal service. He repeated it in the same flat, slightly amused tone he used on first-year residents who gave imprecise answers during rounds. That's vague. Were you folding government pamphlets? Answering phones at the DMV? The corner of Claire's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Not quite anything. They can't be specific about the nature of the work. Dr. Whitfield smiled then, a warm, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Morgan, I appreciate your candor. Let's call it Bethesda Hospital requires more than mystery in its nursing staff. We run complex surgical units. Our patients are not hypothetical. We need people with documented, verifiable experience. What I see here is a nursing degree from a fine but unremarkable program, 4 years of employment history you're unable to discuss, and a handful of letters of recommendation that are, and I mean this constructively, thin. He slid the resume back across the desk, toward her. I'll be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty. Your file doesn't make a case for the level of responsibility this position carries. Our surgical trauma unit is one of the most demanding in the Northeast. We've had applications from nurses with years of ICU experience, critical care certifications, field trauma backgrounds. I'm not certain what you bring to that table. Claire looked at the resume sitting on the edge of the desk between them. She didn't pick it up. I appreciate the honesty, she said. Can I ask one question? Of course. The trauma nursing position isn't still technically open. Dr. Whitfield blinked. Technically, yes, but then I'd like to be considered. He studied her for a moment. There was something in her stillness that was not passivity. He was old enough and sharp enough to sense the difference, but he filed it in the wrong category anyway. He filed it under delusion, under the quiet desperation of the underqualified. He had seen it before in people who wanted something badly enough to ignore all the signals, telling them to want something smaller. I'll make sure your application receives full consideration, he said, in the tone he used when he meant the opposite. He was already thinking about lunch. What Dr. Harrison Whitfield III did not know, what almost no one in that building knew, was that Claire Elise Morgan had, in the 4 years listed as federal service on her resume, served as a special operations combat medic, attached to a classified joint task force operating under the Defense Intelligence Agency. She had treated gunshot wounds in conditions that would have made the Mercy General Trauma Bay look like a spa. She had performed emergency surgical procedures, real ones, with real instruments, in real darkness, with real people dying under her hands, in environments where calling for backup was not an option and failure was not a policy outcome, but a body bag. She had been trained at the most advanced tactical medicine program in the world, a program that didn't have a name on any public document, a program whose graduates were deployed to places that weren't on approved travel lists, and whose after-action reports were classified at levels that required security clearances most people didn't know existed. She had left that world 18 months ago, not because she was asked to leave, and not because she failed at anything. She had left because her younger brother, Tommy, had been diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's at 28 years old, and she had decided quietly, without drama, that she was going to be present for his life in a way that her previous career had made structurally impossible. She had enrolled in the Mercy General University nursing program not because it was her only option, but because it was the fastest legitimate credentialing path to working in a civilian hospital, and because she had thought applying a degree was a degree, Experience was experience, and people who were good at their jobs were recognized for it eventually. She had not fully accounted for the Dr. Whitfields of the world. She walked out of the administrative wing and into the long white corridor of the hospital's main floor. Her resume folded once and tucked into her jacket pocket. She pulled out her phone and looked at a message she had received that morning, before the interview, which she had not yet answered. It was from a number she recognized. It said only, "We have a situation. Call when you can." She stood in the corridor for a moment, the sounds of the hospital moving around her, the soft-wheeled percussion of gurneys, the overhead PA system calling a code on the third floor, the low murmur of a waiting room full of people in various states of worry, and she thought about Tommy, who was at home right now, probably attempting to cook breakfast with hands that shook on bad mornings. Then she thought about the message. Then she pressed call. It rang once. "Morgan," said the voice on the other end. It was a woman's voice, clipped and precise, carrying the particular authority of someone who had not asked for it, but had earned it in places that left marks. "Reyes," Claire said. "Are you clear?" Claire glanced down the corridor. A nurse pushed. A cart passed her. An elderly man in a visitor badge studied the directory board. "Clear enough." Could pause. Brief, but waited. "We need you. Today. I just walked out of a job interview." "I know." Claire stopped walking. "You know, I've been watching the situation develop for 72 hours. I'll explain everything when you get here. There's a car outside the hospital's east exit. It's been there for 20 minutes. Claire turned slowly and looked down the corridor toward the east wing. Through the glass doors at the far end, she could see a black SUV parked at the curb, its engine running, its windows dark. "What's the situation?" she asked. The pause this time was 3 seconds long. In Claire Morgan's experience, a 3-second pause from Colonel Andrea Reyes meant something was genuinely bad. "There's a biocontainment event developing inside a federal facility 40 minutes from your location," Reyes said. "We have casualties. We have a pathogen we don't fully understand yet, and we have 17 people trapped inside a quarantine perimeter with no medical personnel qualified to manage what's in front of them." Claire was already walking toward the east exit. "I'm not credentialed for federal field work anymore," she said. "Yola now," Reyes said. "The secretary signed the reactivation order 40 minutes ago." Claire pushed through the east exit doors. The morning air hit her, cool and carrying the faint smell of car exhaust and cut grass from the hospital's outer grounds. The black SUV's rear door opened as she approached, as if it had been watching for her, which she understood. It had been Dot. She got in, Dot the door closed, the car pulled away from the curb with the quiet, urgent efficiency of something that had, somewhere, very specific to be. Inside Mercy General Hospital, on the third floor, a code was still being called. A doctor was smirking at someone's resume. Lunch was being contemplated. The ordinary machinery of ordinary institutional life turned and turned, grinding its familiar grooves, and Claire Morgan was already gone. The SUV moved through morning traffic with the practiced authority of a vehicle that knew it wouldn't be stopped. Claire sat in the back seat and studied the man beside her, late 40s. Thick through the shoulders, a face like something roughed out in clay and never quite finished. He wore civilian clothes that fit wrong, the way civilian clothes always fit on people who had spent their careers in uniform. He hadn't introduced himself, which told her something. People in Reyes's orbit who didn't introduce themselves were usually operating under compartmentalization protocols, which meant this situation had layers. She looked out the window. They were heading west. Out of the city, toward the industrial corridor that ran along the river's far bank, a landscape of low concrete buildings and chain-link perimeters and infrastructure that didn't announce itself. The kind of geography that existed between things, between the city and the suburbs, between the publicly acknowledged and the carefully unacknowledged. "How many casualties?" she asked. The man beside her glanced at her. His eyes were gray and careful. "Colonel Reyes will brief you on site." "How many are critical?" A pause for, "What's the pathogen vector? On-site, airborne, or contact?" The man turned and looked at her directly for the first time. Something shifted behind the careful gray eyes. A recalibration. "Contact, best current assessment, but it's evolving fast." "How fast?" "Onset to critical in under 3 hours for the first 2 casualties. The other 2 are newer." Claire processed this. 3 hours from exposure to critical condition was aggressive. It suggested either an engineered agent or something naturally occurring with an unusually potent binding mechanism. Neither option was comfortable. "What's the facility?" she asked. "Classified. I have reactivated federal clearance. The facility classification is above the reactivation tier. You'll be read in on arrival." She let it go and looked back out the window. The city had thinned behind them. Ahead she could see a perimeter fence set back from the road, not dramatic. No guard towers, nothing that would attract attention from the highway. Just a fence, chain-link topped with 3 strands of wire, and a gate, and a small building beside the gate that could have been a security booth at a private business. but there were vehicles clustered near it that didn't belong to any private business too. More black SUVs, a white van with no markings, and a military transport truck, dark green, idling with its back doors open, and standing beside the military transport, arms crossed, reading something on a tablet, was Colonel Andrea Reyes. She was 52, slim, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of posture that took decades of consequence to build. She had been Claire's commanding officer for 3 of the 4 years of Claire's federal service, and she was the closest thing Claire had professionally, and in the carefully bounded way that operational life permitted to someone she trusted without qualification. The SUV stopped. Claire got out before the driver could open her door. Reyes looked up from the tablet. She didn't smile. She almost never did. In the field, but something in her expression shifted in a way that Claire recognized as the operational equivalent of relief. Morgan could not walk with me. She turned without waiting. Claire fell into step beside her, matching the pace. Here's what we know. This is a Tier 3 biological research annex. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's been operating for 11 years under a joint DIA-DARPA research charter. The work being done here is defensive countermeasure development, detection protocols, vaccine precursor research. Nothing offensive. And I say that because I need you to understand the people inside are not responsible for what happened to them. What did happen to them? Reyes glanced at her. We think a containment vessel failed. A research sample, one of the more aggressive subjects in their current study, may have been exposed to a microfracture during a routine transport within the lab. It's not confirmed. The lead researcher, Dr. Paul Granger, was the first casualty. He's currently unconscious, vitals deteriorating. 2 of his research assistants followed within 90 minutes. And the 4th? Reyes's jaw tightened. A millimeter of tension that Claire had learned to read as something worse coming. A security officer who entered the lab when the first distress call came in. He didn't know what he was walking into. Nobody told him. The communication system had a partial failure concurrent with the containment event. We're looking into why. The way Reyes said, looking into why carried significant weight. The remaining 13 people are in a sealed secondary area, a break room, and 2 adjoining offices on the building's north side. They have no medical personnel. They have a first aid kit, a water cooler, and, as of 40 minutes ago, working phone lines. What are they presenting? 2 are reporting symptom onset, fever, disorientation, elevated sensitivity to light. One of those 2 was present in the main lab this morning. The other claims to have had no direct contact with the research area, so either the contact assessment is wrong, or there's a secondary transmission mechanism, which is why we need you inside. Claire stopped walking. Reyes stopped a step later and turned. You want me to enter the containment perimeter? Claire said yes. With an incompletely characterized pathogen in an active exposure environment, with full PPE level B. At minimum, we're evaluating level A. The 4 casualties, do they have treatment coverage right now? A paramedic from a local unit responded to the initial distress call before we had federal control of the scene. He's done what he can. He's asking to be rotated out. Who's the on-call infectious disease physician for your medical support team? Reyes's expression didn't change, but the pause before she spoke told Claire everything. Our ID physician is currently on a transport from Fort Detrick, 8 to 90 minutes. So you have no qualified medical personnel on site. We have you. I'm a nurse. Colonel, with a degree from Mercy General University, as a doctor reminded me, 45 minutes ago. You're the most qualified person within 90 minutes of this building, Reyes said, and there was no flattery in it. It was an operational statement, of fact. The way she had always spoken, stripped of everything unnecessary. You've managed trauma in active environments. You've performed procedures under field conditions that most physicians wouldn't attempt in a full surgical suite. I am not asking you to be something you're not. I am asking you to go in there and keep 4 people alive for 90 minutes. Until Hendricks arrives. Claire looked at the facility. Low, concrete, beige, in the way that things built for function and not aesthetics are beige. Behind those walls, 4 people were deteriorating at a rate of 3 hours too critical. Behind those walls, 30 and more were frightened, and at least 2 of them were already beginning to feel the early signs of something that didn't have a name in any public medical database. That she thought about Dr. Whitfield's smirk. She thought about the resume sliding back across the desk. She thought about Tommy at home, attempting to scramble eggs with hands that betrayed him on bad mornings, and the reason she had come back to civilian life, and the specific shape of the choice she was standing inside. I need a full brief on the pathogen, she said. Everything they have, including the preliminary characterization data, even if it's incomplete. I need the PPE inventory, I need the communications set up for in-containment contact, and I need the paramedic to talk me through exactly what he's seen before I go in. Reyes was already turning. All of it is waiting. And I need Whitfield's hospital on standby for potential transfer. Reyes stopped. Mercy General, Claire said. Tell them to prep an infectious disease isolation suite. Dr. Whitfield is chief of surgery. He'll need to be read in to the minimum extent necessary to prepare his facility. Reyes looked at her with an expression that was, in Reyes's limited emotional register, close to something wry. The hospital you just left? The same. And the doctor who interviewed you this morning. He'll need to be the one to prep the suite, Claire said. He's the senior physician on site. That's who we call. So he walked toward the facility entrance without waiting for a response. Behind her, Colonel Reyes pulled out her phone and began to dial. 40 minutes later, Dr. Harrison Whitfield III would answer his office line, mid-bite of a turkey club sandwich, and hear the words, Department of Defense and Federal Medical Emergency, and your cooperation is required by order of the Pentagon. And the turkey club would become very unimportant very quickly. But that was 40 minutes away. Ronald, Claire Morgan was suiting up. The PPE donning process took 11 minutes. Claire moved through it with the methodical attention of someone who understood that a single compromised seal was not an inconvenience, but a death sentence hers. Potentially, and certainly a complication for everyone else. The hazmat technician, assisting her a young man named Specialist Derek Oates, who couldn't have been more than 23, and who was visibly working hard to project calm. Checked each connection point twice, without being asked. She appreciated that. She spent 12 minutes with the paramedic who was rotating out. His name was Kyle Farrow, 38, with the particular exhausted focus of someone who had been managing a crisis on adrenaline and competence alone for the past 2 hours. He walked her through each of the 4 casualties with the practiced economy of a field report. Vitals, presentation sequence, any interventions he'd attempted, response to those interventions. Dr. Paul Granger, 61. Lead researcher, exposure confirmed, earliest onset, currently unconscious, pulse steady at 98. BP 88/54, temperature 104.7, pupils unequal and sluggish. Kyle had established an IV line, running saline. Granger had been conscious enough, 40 minutes ago, to tell Kyle the name of the sample involved, a designation that meant nothing to Kyle but that Claire wrote down in her mental file precisely and completely. Research Assistant Dana Cho, 29-second onset, currently semi-conscious, in and out of coherence. Fever 103.1, elevated heart rate, significant photosensitivity. She had asked to be moved away from the overhead lights, and was now lying with a jacket draped over her eyes. She was responding to verbal stimuli, knew her name and the date, but was losing the thread between sentences. Research Assistant Marcus Tilley, 34, third onset, milder, at present. Ambulatory, frightened, running a fever of 101.4. He was one of the 2 in the secondary holding area of the break room who had reported symptoms. His exposure history was unclear. He insisted he hadn't been in the main lab since the previous afternoon. Security Officer Ray Briggs, 45th casualty, most concerning in some respects because his trajectory was steeper than the others relative to his exposure time. He had entered the main lab area 47 minutes after the initial containment failure. Theoretically, after the primary aerosolization event would have settled, and yet he was presenting more acutely than Tilley, who had a longer exposure. Window BP 94/60, temperature 103.8. And in the last 20 minutes he had developed a rash across his forearms and neck that none of the other casualties were showing. The rash is new, Kyle said. Started maybe 15 minutes before you arrived. I don't know what to do with it. You did the right things, Claire told him. Go. He looked at her with the conflicted expression of someone who was both desperate to leave and reluctant to abandon responsibility. You got this? Go, she said again, not unkindly. He went. She entered the facility through the decontamination airlock with a field kit that had been assembled. On Reyes's standing emergency authorization from the medical supplies in the military transport vehicle, it was not ideal. It was significantly better than a first aid kit and a water cooler. The facility interior was aggressively ordinary in the way of institutional spaces everywhere. Drop ceilings, fluorescent lighting, gray linoleum, the faint ambient hum of climate control systems. The main corridor was empty and silent except for that hum and the distant sound, from behind a closed door to her left, of someone weeping quietly. The door to her right bore a biohazard symbol and a keypad lock that had been manually overridden, its door propped open 6 inches. Granger and Cho were in there. Briggs had been moved to the corridor outside the main lab, too unstable to transport further. Not ideal to keep in the primary exposure environment. She went to Briggs first, because of the rash. He was lying on the floor, his back against the corridor wall, a folded jacket under his head. He was conscious barely. His eyes tracked her approach, and he said, with the particular effort of someone conserving energy for each word, Am I going to die? Not on my shift, Claire said, and crouched beside him, opening the field kit. She checked his pulse -1, elevated, irregular in a way she didn't like, and took his pressure with a manual cuff. Because the portable electronic unit sometimes read falsely in patients running high fevers. 92/58, lower than Kyle's last reading. She examined the rash. Raised, red, with a slightly purplish undertone at the edges of each mark. Distributed in a pattern that was not random, it tracked, she realized, along the vascular pathways visible on his forearms. That was not a typical febrile rash. That was something interacting with his vascular system specifically. She filed this. She adjusted the saline drip Kyle had established. Added a measured dose from the field kit's emergency antihistamine supply, not because she was certain it would help, but because if there was a hypersensitivity component driving the vascular response, early antihistamine coverage was defensible, and moved to the main lab. Granger was worse than Kyle's report had suggested, or had deteriorated in the interval. His breathing was shallow and irregular. She assessed, adjusted, made the decisions that could be made with what she had, and moved continuously, because the geography of this emergency required her to be in multiple places. And there was only one of her. Dana Cho was awake when Claire reached her. "Your Medi-Cal?" Dana said, from under the jacket. "Yes. Is it the RX-7 sample? Did Paul tell you?" Her voice was careful, precise, fighting through the fever's fog. "Because if it's RX-7, the spike protein has a vascular affinity component. It's in the preliminary characterization data. We published an internal memo in February. I need you to tell whoever's running this that the treatment protocol for a standard hemorrhagic pathogen won't work. The vascular component requires." She stopped, swallowed, pressed the jacket tighter to her eyes against the light. "It requires a different approach. Corticosteroid support, anti-inflammatory for protocol, not just supportive care." Claire stared at her. "You wrote in the February memo?" she asked. "I co-wrote it. Paul and I? It's in the facility's research archive. File designation RX-7, SHAR-2-5-0-2. Dana's voice was losing coherence at the edges, but the information inside was perfectly intact. The way that certain types of brilliant people could carry precise knowledge through the fever all the way to the last moment. "Please tell them." "I'm telling them right now," Claire said, and keyed her communications link to Reyes Colonel. "I need you to pull a research archive file. RX-7-CHAR-22502. It's an internal characterization memo from February, and I need your medical supply chain to confirm my availability of corticosteroid for support, specifically methylprednisone if you can get it, and a full anti-inflammatory for protocol compatible with the field kit we have on site." A 3-second pause. Then, "Copy. Working on it." "The rash on Briggs is a vascular marker," Claire continued. "The pathogen has a vascular affinity component. Standard hemorrhagic protocols are contraindicated. I need you to relay this to Dr. Hendricks before he arrives, so he's walking in with the right framework." "Copy, Morgan. What's your assessment of the other two?" She looked at Granger. "Granger is critical. He needs ICU-level intervention within the hour. He's not going to wait 90 minutes. Elongated pause. "We're working on accelerating transport, and a beat Mercy General is standing by. Dr. Whitfield has been read in. He's preparing the isolation suite." "Good." Claire looked at the lab around her. The overturned containment station. The single broken vessel in its sealed secondary enclosure. The equipment of a facility doing careful, important work that had been undone by the failure of something millimeters small. "Tell Dr. Whitfield that the incoming patient is going to need vascular support, not standard hemorrhagic protocol. He'll want to argue about that, because the standard protocol is what his training tells him. Tell him the on-site medical assessment is definitive, and the Pentagon is backing it." Another pause. And then Reyes said, in a tone that was, by her standards, close to amused, "Understood." In the break room, through a closed door, Claire heard someone ask if everything was going to be okay. She heard another voice, steadier, making the effort say that, yes, they thought it was. She kept working. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. 90 minutes, she had told herself. She worked as if time was the only enemy, which, in rooms like this, it almost always was. Dr. Harrison Whitfield III had eaten half a turkey club sandwich, answered 2 emails, and was in the middle of mentally composing a rejection letter for Claire Morgan's nursing application when his office rang. He answered it with the mild irritation of someone interrupted during important internal work. And then the words, "Department of Defense," reached him, followed shortly by "Federal Medical Emergency," followed by "Your facility has been designated as the receiving location for Pentagon-directed patient transfers." And the Turkey Club became, as noted, a very different kind of concern. He had spent 20 minutes on the phone with an increasingly senior series of voices, each one calmer and more authoritative than the last, until he was speaking with someone who identified himself only as a deputy director and who explained, in terms that were both courteous and absolutely not negotiable, that Mercy General's isolation suite needed to be ready within the hour, that the incoming patients had a pathogen profile that would be transmitted to his ID team, and that treatment protocol guidance had been issued by the on-site medical personnel and was to be followed. "Who is the on-site medical personnel, Doctor?" Whitfield had asked. There was a brief pause. "A federally reactivated specialist with direct patient contact and characterization data from the site's own research team. What's their specialty? Tactical medicine and emergency trauma care. Their assessment of the vascular pathology has been corroborated by the facility's own research documentation. Are they a physician? The voice on the other end of the phone had paused again, not the pause of someone who didn't know the answer, but the pause of someone deciding how to frame it. They are the most qualified medical professional currently in contact with these patients, and their protocol guidance has been endorsed at the level of the Secretary of Defense. I'd recommend preparing your team in accordance with that guidance. Dr. Whitfield? The call ended. Whitfield sat for a moment in the particular silence of someone whose entire established framework for how the world works has just been quietly, firmly moved around him. Then he picked up his phone and began calling his department heads, because, whatever else he was competent in a crisis. And a crisis was clearly what this was. The first patient transport arrived at Mercy General's isolation bay 2 hours and 14 minutes after Claire Morgan had entered the containment facility. Dr. Paul Granger arrived first, unconscious and critical, his vitals barely sustained by the interventions Claire had implemented and maintained while simultaneously managing the other 3 casualties and coordinating with Reyes's team on the outside. He was transferred to Mercy General's isolation suite with the full corticosteroid and anti-inflammatory 4 protocol that the February internal memo had outlined, adapted by Claire and transmitted to the hospital's ID team 20 minutes before Granger's transport left the facility. The security officer Ray Briggs arrived 20 minutes later, conscious, frightened, and stabilizing. The rash on his arms had stopped spreading. His blood pressure was rising, slowly, toward something that looked less like a cliff edge. Dr. Hendricks, the infectious disease physician from Fort Detrick, had arrived at the facility with 4 minutes to spare on Claire's 90-minute estimate. He had walked in with the RX-7 characterization memo already read, the treatment framework already understood, and had spent 30 seconds looking at what Claire had established before saying, simply, "Good calls, all of them." She had nodded and kept working. He had worked beside her for the next hour, and by the time the last of the secondary area residents had been cleared, confirmed non-symptomatic after observation, released to decontamination and federal debriefing, Marcus Tilley's fever had broken, and Dana Cho was sitting up, asking for water, and reciting from memory the additional characterization data. She was worried the team might have missed. They hadn't missed it. Claire had relayed it all. It was late afternoon when Claire walked out of the facility. The sunlight had shifted lower, more golden. The specific quality of spring afternoon light that makes everything look briefly like a painting of itself. She pulled the PPE hood back and breathed real air for the first time in hours. Her feet ached, her shoulders ached, her eyes felt like they had been open for a week. Reyes was waiting near the perimeter fence. 2 cups of coffee and the particular expression of someone who had been watching a situation resolve correctly. She handed Claire a cup. "Hendricks says Granger's going to make it," Reyes said. "I know. He called me. All 4 casualties are stable. I know. The 13 and secondary holding are cleared. Nobody else presented symptoms." Reyes paused. "You want to know something interesting? I want to drink this coffee." The February memo, the characterization data Cho and Granger wrote. It was never formally submitted up the chain. It was an internal document. If Cho hadn't been able to tell you about it while she was running a 103-degree fever, we would have gone in treating this as a standard hemorrhagic event. Claire thought about Dana Cho, lying on the floor of a contaminated lab, its jacket over her eyes, fighting through the fever, to transmit the precise file designation of a document that none of the people on the outside had known to look for. "She saved them," Claire said. "I just carried the information." "You carried it to the right places and made the right decisions with it," Reyes said. "That's not nothing." Claire drank the coffee. It was terrible. She kept drinking it. The call came at 6:47 p.m. She was in the back of a different black SUV, this one heading back toward the city, when her phone showed an incoming call from a number she recognized as Mercy General's main administrative line. She considered not answering. Then she answered. "Ms. Morgan," Dr. Whitfield's voice. It had a different quality than it had held that morning, still controlled, but the easy authority had been replaced by something more careful. "I'm calling from Mercy General. Our isolation suite is currently managing 2 of the patients transferred from today's federal incident." "I know," she said. "I arranged the transfer." A brief pause. "Yes, I've been made aware of your involvement in today's events." She waited. "I've been speaking with Dr. Hendricks from Fort Detrick, and with the administration team coordinating the federal response." Whitfield continued. "And I've reviewed a number of documents that were transmitted to us as part of the briefing protocol." Another pause. "I owe you an apology, Ms. Morgan." She looked out the window at the city coming back into view, the familiar geometry of streets and buildings, the ordinary magnificent complexity of a place full of people living their ordinary lives, unaware that 40 minutes away, in a beige, concrete building behind a chain-link fence, the morning had been something else entirely. "The position," Whitfield said. "The trauma nursing position. It's yours, if you still want it." "And he stopped. started again. I handled the interview this morning with a bias I wasn't aware I was carrying, and I made assumptions that the record clearly doesn't support. No, it's Ronnie, I'm sorry. Claire was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved past the restaurants and pharmacies and apartment buildings and coffee shops, the parks where children were being watched by parents, the streets where dogs were being walked, the windows lit gold by the evening light. I'll come in Monday morning, she said. We can discuss the terms. Of course. A pause. And Ms. Morgan, whatever you were doing for those 4 years. He stopped himself. I won't ask. But thank you for what you did today. She ended the call. The SUV moved through the city. The driver said nothing, and she was grateful for it. She called Tommy. He answered on the second ring, and she could tell from the ease in his voice that it had been a good day. One of the better ones. The kind where his hands were steady enough that he'd made breakfast and done the crossword and maybe even taken a walk. He asked her how the interview went. She told him she'd gotten the job. He said that was great. That was really great. He knew she would. He'd never doubted it for a second. She looked out the window. Neither did I, she said, which was not quite true and was also, in the way that the most important things often are, entirely true. She rode the rest of the way home through the golden evening, through the city that had no idea what the day had held, past all the lit windows and all the ordinary lives being lived behind them, feeling the weight of the last 10 hours in her shoulders and her feet and the particular place behind her eyes where exhaustion and something quieter, something that had no clean name but that felt, when she let herself acknowledge it, like purpose lived side by side. Monday morning, she would walk into Mercy General through the front entrance. Not the east exit, not a side door, the front. She would badge in, find her locker, put on her scrubs, and go to work. That was enough. That was, she thought, watching the city scroll past the dark window, more than enough.